Hello, Jen Schwimmer here. Welcome to today's vlog, and a special welcome to a new subscriber, Brady Smith. Welcome to the family, Brady. I hope you'll bring some other subscribers along with you, but also I just want to mention that I know about Brady because I got a notice on my channel that I got a new subscriber, but I seem to get more subscribers than I get notices for. I don't know if that's true, maybe it's just my imagination, but in case I didn't mention any subscriber, it's because I didn't know about it. I get these notices. Whenever I get a notice, I say hi and welcome to the new subscriber, at least for now. I'm hoping, of course, that someday I'll get so many subscribers that I won't be able to name all of you, but I'm not at that point yet. Today, I'm just going to cover one little item here, and then I'll go on to the main subject. The little item is just, well, here's a headline. Pompeo planned to address RNC, that would be the Republican National Committee, from Israel upsets Jewish Democrats. I'm a Jewish conservative. I'm independent. I'm not a Republican, but that's the way I usually vote. I guess I'm well, I won't say a black sheep because there are actually quite a few Jewish Republicans and Jewish conservatives, and actually some of the most conservative Jewish Republicans are the very religious Jews. But we are still a minority within a minority, I suppose. Most Jews are Democrats, so we have here Jewish Democrats upset that Pompeo is addressing the RNC. The convention, as you know, is going on, at least when I'm recording this, on Monday. They're upset that he is addressing the RNC from Israel because it helps Jewish Republicans, and it helps Donald Trump to show the solidarity between Israel and the United States, to support that my Christian friends, the overwhelming majority of them, my Christian fellow Americans, give to Israel, which is greatly appreciated by me personally and, of course, by the Israelis. But there are a lot of Jewish Democrats who are so wedded to the Democratic Party that if a Republican, especially Donald Trump, does something good for Israel, it makes them angry. That's number one. Number two, because they are, being liberals, wedded to this whole peace process and a Palestinian state, the two-state solution. They are wedded to that concept. They don't want to let it go. They hate to see Trump taking a completely different approach and succeeding. But also, I'm sad to say that a lot of Jewish Democrats, they just don't like Israel. They consider Israel a right-wing, well, because the right-wing party is ascendant in Israel. There used to be a very strong left-wing party in Israel. That left wing has practically disappeared. So that is another reason probably why they don't like Israel. But they're claiming that Pompeo is violating the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act says that you cannot use government resources or federal government resources to campaign for political purposes. So, for instance, to use a real obvious example, you can't set up a phone bank to solicit campaign funds in a room in the White House. If Donald Trump wants to solicit contributions, he cannot even make a single phone call from, say, the Oval Office, because that violates the Hatch Act. So they are saying that because Pompeo took this trip to Israel and he's addressing the RNC from Israel, that he's violating the Hatch Act, which is, well, it's just absurd, because Pompeo did not go to Israel for political purposes. He went there to talk to Israeli leaders. As everybody knows by now, the United Arab Emirates has signed a peace agreement with Israel for full relations, and Pompeo was there about that because the Emiratis want to buy weapons, and the Israelis are concerned about what weapons the United States would sell to the UAE or any Arab country, because there is a doctrine that Israel would always have military superiority over the surrounding Arab countries, many of whom are enemies with Israel. And even though the UAE is now a friend of Israel, who can predict the future? And though I don't believe this for a minute, it's possible that some country could sign a peace agreement just to, for instance, be able to buy F-35s, which they cannot right now. Israel is the only country in the Middle East that can buy F-35s. That gives them a great advantage over the air forces of all the surrounding Arab countries. The point is that Pompeo is there on business. Now, if Pompeo were to fly back from Israel to the RNC specifically to address the RNC and then flew back to Israel, that obviously would be a political trip, and that would violate the Hatch Act. But he's not doing that, and the campaign made a public statement that anything having to do with the campaign is being paid for by the campaign, even if Pompeo is in Israel. Just wanted to mention that. And now on to today's subject, which is about New York. So I guess I have to tell everybody again, especially new visitors, that I lived in New York for 40 years. I lived in New York from 1977 till, we'll say, early January 2019. A little over a year and a half ago I moved here, so I'm still interested in New York. But this has wider implications beyond New York. I'm talking about the broken windows theory that Giuliani, Mayor Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, used to turn New York City around when, after decades of damage by Democratic mayors, especially liberal Democratic mayors, and John Lindsay, who technically was a Republican but very, very liberal, might as well have been a liberal Democrat. The situation in New York when I arrived in 1977 was pretty bad. Now, to be fair, there was a certain energy. There were smaller stores doing interesting products. Now it's a lot of these big chain stores because the rents are so high. You had clubs like CBGB where all the punk rock bands played, and I actually lived pretty much around the block from CBGB's, across the street and around the block on Elizabeth Street. I won't go into details, relive my old memories. The point is that Giuliani instituted this broken windows theory. The theory is that you can have a nice neighborhood and then suppose somebody throws a rock through a window, you don't fix the window, then somebody else will come along and break another window, then another, and then eventually, and very quickly, often you have urban blight. You have a decrepit neighborhood, and it brings in drug dealers and criminals, and decent people move out. That is the broken windows theory. Now, here's this headline that I just saw today: don't bring back broken windows. Manhattan DA Cy Vance argues against ratcheting back up prosecutions for smaller offenses, which is what the broken windows theory was. But it wasn't just arresting for offenses. It was literally what I said, broken windows. In other words, well, in New York, it was dirty streets, it was vagrants all over the place, homeless people, and it was graffiti all over the subways. Every subway car was covered with graffiti. It just made the quality of life miserable. It was crazy people going up and down the street, shouting, breaking car windows, and the police not doing anything because the theory then was, worry about the serious crimes, don't go after petty criminals, or this famous squeegee men. If you don't know what a squeegee man is, these were guys that would stand by street corners with a squeegee and a bucket of water. Somebody would stop at a stoplight and the squeegee man would clean off the windshield and then demand money. The point is, it just made life really bad. I won't get to the point of unbearable, but you were just surrounded by all this stuff all the time. And the broken windows theory, a major part of it was that you get rid of that so the subways are clean, so you don't have the squeegee men on the corner, so you don't have homeless people all over the place. Then New York becomes, or any city becomes, more pleasant. Now, the petty crime part is, one of the things that bothered me, out of the many things in this article, I'm not going to quote the whole article to you, but the DA talked about not arresting fare beaters, people that get on a bus or a subway and they don't pay the fare. Well, that makes the fare more expensive. That used to drive me crazy. That was one of the things that drove me out of New York, because you have, well, it's a little harder to jump a turnstile in the subway station, but in the buses open in the front and back, and then decent people, law-abiding people, such as myself, would pay the fare, go in the front door and pay the fare. But then you'd have several people very often pile in the back door, and I would stand there. I don't want to start a fight with 5 guys, but it would just bother me. They would just jump on for free, and it makes the fares more expensive. Or you just have, well, that's what you have. The MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, they are losing money, especially now with this coronavirus, and you have very little ridership because people are afraid of getting coronavirus, so they don't get on the subway onto a crowded subway car, because especially at rush hour, it's standing room only, very crowded, so people are afraid, so they're losing money in that respect. But even before that, the MTA was losing money because people were not paying fares. I can't say that caused the whole problem, but that certainly contributed to it. And he's talking about, well, he's claiming that the broken windows theory did nothing to reduce violent crime, which is just absurd to me, because I lived in New York from 1977. I saw how the city was until Giuliani came in and instituted the broken windows theory. Also, community policing and using computers to find hot spots of crime and then sending extra police to those areas to damp it down before it got too great. That definitely worked. Now, this DA, he's citing the last 10 years or so, but yeah, it takes time for the situation to get worse again, but also de Blasio was not the mayor. Bloomberg was the mayor for many years, for 12 years after Giuliani. So you had 8 years of Giuliani, then you had 12 of Bloomberg, and life was okay then as far as the quality of life, just walking down the street and getting off a subway, just being, well, before Giuliani, you wouldn't catch me in Harlem. The last 10 years before I moved here, after Giuliani, I lived in Harlem. That's how stark the difference was. And now you can read story after story about New York, how it's sliding back. This DA, Cy Vance, now he's talking about in this article also that they're not using stop and frisk. Now you have to remember there's basically no Second Amendment in New York. You can't carry a concealed weapon to protect yourself if you're law-abiding, unless you're willing to risk getting caught. But if you carry the weapon, it's against the law, so then you're no longer law-abiding, logically. But criminals don't have that problem. They carry the guns. So one of the ways to fight crime was stop and frisk. Cy Vance is talking about the epidemic of gun violence. I read one article, the crime rate on the Upper East Side, which is a very wealthy, exclusive area, crime has gone up, violent crime I'm talking about, has gone up 288%. That's how bad it is in this great neighborhood in the Upper East Side. So you can imagine some of the other not so great neighborhoods, what it must be like. So the city wanted to reduce the number of guns, of illegal guns, and the way they did that was stop and frisk. They would stop suspicious characters and they would frisk them and occasionally find a gun that got those people off the street. That was the first thing, got them off the street, but also it dissuaded other people from carrying guns because they could be stopped and frisked. The problem was most of these people were minorities, and well, that's what we're seeing all over about the police, that not to racially profile people, but those are where the guns were. I mean, if you live in Harlem, there aren't that many white people. I can tell you because I lived there. I didn't see a whole lot of white people. You'd see an increasing number, but most people are black. So if you're going to fight crime in Harlem, you're talking about arresting black people. Sorry, it's not racism. It's just that almost everybody in Harlem is black. So I want to start from that because what most illustrates the broken windows theory, I mentioned New York, but where you really see it is in these other cities such as Portland and Seattle. But I'm going to stick with Portland where it's the worst. It's the antifa thugs that are roaming the streets. But this is what I mean by the broken window theory. Here's a typical photo of Antifa thugs just rioting. The fires being set, the attacks on police stations, on federal courthouses. But now look at this photo. You want to know who that is? That's Antifa. That is Antifa. But that's Antifa in 2017. So you see from 2017 to today, 2020, how Antifa has metastasized. And it's because in Portland, well, you could do some searching. I've read a number of articles. I couldn't find a specific photo because there's so many recent photos of Antifa and these mass riots and demonstrations and fights with the police and attacking innocent people. But if you go way back, you see photos like the one I showed you, or they would be dressed in black, these spoiled children, these Antifa thugs, and they would be harassing some old guy crossing the street or stopping somebody's car. But there would only be 4 or 5 of them, a very small group that two cops could very easily stop, grab them, arrest them, throw them against the car, frisk them, put them in jail, charge them, and give them a nice jail sentence if found guilty. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that. They didn't fight Antifa, these liberal Democratic mayors, when the problem was small and easily could have been dealt with. The broken window theory is right. It works, and we see today in Portland and Seattle and Minneapolis and now Kenosha, Wisconsin, all of these cities, and New York, you see what happens when you don't attack a problem early, when it's small, you leave it alone, you let it metastasize from only 2017 to 2020. You see what happens because they would not deal with the problem earlier. Now they got a very big problem. And to give credit where credit is due, the governor of Wisconsin has called in the National Guard to deal with the problem in Kenosha. That is what should be done. It should have been done earlier and could have been done only with police, but kudos to that governor, because that governor made a very sympathetic statement in the very beginning of the disturbances, but changed his mind as they got worse and worse and is now calling in the National Guard, which is what happened, by the way, growing up in Detroit. I said I lived in New York. I came there in 1977, but I was born in Detroit, as you can tell, quite some time ago, 1952. So I was in Detroit for the 67 riots. Those were pretty bad, but the National Guard was called in within a few days, and they put it down, and they did not play around. They did not treat these rioters, or those rioters at the time, with kid gloves, which seems to be the case now, that the rioters, even when they are arrested, that they are being released without charge. And it's just insane. It is just insane. All I can say is vote Republican if you don't want the whole country to be like these cities. As a wise person said, if they can't run, if the Democrats cannot govern a city, then why would you want them to govern the whole country? And if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, why would you not want to give me a thumbs up if you liked the video? Share it with anybody you think would also like the video. If you've got any comments, you can put them in the comment section below the video with any questions you might have, suggestions for future topics. You could join Brady Smith and subscribe. That would be really fantastic. But most of all, come back and see me again. I look forward to seeing all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.